This morning, the trade war is now impacting tomatoes. A new policy kicks in today, making way for a 21% price hike on tomato imports.
It comes as the Trump administration has also announced new tariffs that could raise the price of tomatoes at the grocery stores.
Crazy, everybody was in here buying tomatoes, you know, and with the economy the way that it is, if you're saving a few pennies and you're supporting local, that everybody wins in that situation. The customer wins, it brings us business, so we're selling more product.
Imagine walking into your local grocery store, only to find the price of a simple tomato doubled overnight, or worse, shelves completely empty. Sounds absurd, right? But behind the scenes, that exact nightmare is unfolding across America. A headline started it all: U.S. tomato shipments rejected, Mexico lands billion-dollar deals. The story exploded across social media, sparking outrage, confusion, and wild theories. Was Mexico really turning its back on the United States? Were American farmers being crushed by a hidden betrayal? Or was this just another case of politics destroying the food on our tables? The truth is far more shocking than the headlines suggest. Because what's happening right now isn't just about tomatoes, it's about a silent economic war playing out on our dinner plates. A decades-old trade deal has collapsed, protectionist tariffs are back, and the delicate balance that kept food prices stable for millions of families has suddenly shattered. And here's the kicker. This so-called tomato war isn't only about farmers or grocery bills. It's a billion-dollar power struggle that could redefine how America trades with the world, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. It all started with a headline that spread like wildfire. U.S. tomato shipments rejected, Mexico lands billion-dollar deals. Within hours, it wasn't just a news item, it was a frenzy. Social media lit up. Hashtags trended. People were asking, did Mexico just slam the door on America's farmers? Were U.S. tomatoes really being thrown back at the border? On TikTok and Twitter, the story snowballed into wild speculation. Some claimed it was Mexico's revenge for years of trade disputes. Others said American tomatoes were being humiliated on the world stage. Conspiracy theories even suggested foreign buyers were deliberately boycotting U.S. produce. The narrative was too juicy to ignore: betrayal, billion-dollar deals, and an agricultural giant supposedly turning its back on the United States. It sounded like a plot ripped straight out of a political thriller. But here's the catch. While the internet argued about rejections and secret billion-dollar contracts, the real story was playing out quietly, buried under noise. And the truth wasn't about a dramatic rejection at the border. It was about something much deeper, something far more dangerous to America's food supply. Because behind those viral headlines was a crisis decades in the making, one that would test farmers, consumers, and entire economies on both sides of the border. And what came next would shock almost everyone who believed the hype. It all started with a headline that spread like wildfire. U.S. tomato shipments rejected, Mexico lands billion-dollar deals. Within hours, it wasn't just a news item, it was a frenzy. Social media lit up. Hashtags trended. People were asking, did Mexico just slam the door on America's farmers? Were U.S. tomatoes really being thrown back at the border? On TikTok and Twitter, the story snowballed into wild speculation. Some claimed it was Mexico's revenge for years of trade disputes. Others said American tomatoes were being humiliated on the world stage. Conspiracy theories even suggested foreign buyers were deliberately boycotting U.S. produce. The narrative was too juicy to ignore: betrayal, billion-dollar deals, and an agricultural giant supposedly turning its back on the United States. It sounded like a plot ripped straight out of a political thriller. But here's the catch. While the internet argued about rejections and secret billion-dollar contracts, the real story was playing out quietly, buried under noise. And the truth wasn't about a dramatic rejection at the border. It was about something much deeper, something far more dangerous to America's food supply. Because behind those viral headlines was a crisis decades in the making, one that would test farmers, consumers, and entire economies on both sides of the border. And what came next would shock almost everyone who believed the hype. July 2025. Out of nowhere, the U.S. government dropped a bombshell. It was pulling out of the tomato suspension agreement. The official reason? Washington claimed Mexican growers were selling tomatoes at unfairly low prices to dominate the market. The solution? Slap a 17% tariff on every single tomato crossing the border to Florida farmers. This was a victory years in the making. They'd been fighting for this moment, arguing that Mexico's cheaper labor and looser rules made it impossible to compete. When the decision came down, they celebrated like it was Independence Day. But for almost everyone else in the supply chain, importers, distributors, grocery retailers, even restaurant owners, this wasn't a win. It was a gut punch. The system they'd relied on for nearly 3 decades collapsed overnight. Suddenly, the cost of Mexican tomatoes jumped by nearly a fifth, and the ripple effects started racing through the market. The celebration in Florida was drowned out by panic everywhere else. Economists warned of shockwaves. Distributors scrambled to rewrite contracts. Consumers braced for price hikes. And American supermarkets? They were left staring at a terrifying possibility: empty shelves. Because here's the truth: America could cheer all it wanted about protecting its farmers, but without Mexico, the U.S. food system was about to learn just how fragile it really was. And the first cracks showed up in the very thing most Americans take for granted: their weekly grocery trip. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States loves to talk about buying American, but when it comes to tomatoes, it simply can't. Yes, U.S. farms grow plenty of tomatoes, but only for part of the year. When the cold months roll in, American fields go quiet. And that's exactly when demand stays high. Think about it. Restaurants don't stop serving burgers, tacos, or salads just because it's January. Families don't stop buying cherry tomatoes for school lunches in the winter. The demand never drops, but U.S. supply does. That's where Mexico steps in. With its warm climate and massive agricultural infrastructure, Mexico doesn't just help the U.S. tomato market. It keeps it alive. In fact, 7 out of every 10 fresh tomatoes eaten in America today come from Mexico. Without those shipments, shelves in U.S. supermarkets would thin out fast. Prices would skyrocket. And the variety Americans are used to, grape tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, would vanish almost overnight. Imagine walking into a Walmart or Costco and finding nothing but a few overpriced, bruised tomatoes from Florida. That's the kind of reality experts warned about when tariffs went into effect. Even big players like NatureSweet, one of the largest tomato companies straddling both sides of the border, sounded the alarm. They warned that consumers in colder states, where fresh produce already relies almost entirely on imports, would be hit the hardest. Families in Chicago, New York, Boston, they'd pay the price for a trade war they had no control over, and the danger wasn't just about tomatoes. Economists pointed out something bigger. This exposed a supply chain vulnerability no one could ignore. A single policy change, one signature in Washington, had the power to trigger shortages, raise prices, and send shockwaves across 2 economies. And if that sounds bad, wait until you see what happened in the border towns that live and breathe off this trade. Because for them, this wasn't just about food prices. It was about survival. If you really want to see how dangerous this trade war is, you don't look at Washington or Wall Street. You look at the border, places like Laredo and Pharr, Texas. These cities aren't just border towns. They're the beating heart of America's fresh produce supply chain. Every day, thousands of trucks roll through their checkpoints, carrying Mexican tomatoes, peppers, avocados, and more into the U.S. The warehouses hum nonstop, customs officers process mountains of paperwork, and entire neighborhoods rely on the flow of produce to keep their local economies alive. And here's the staggering reality. A single Texas A&M University study revealed that Mexican tomato imports support more than 32,000 jobs in Texas alone. Think about that number: truck drivers, warehouse workers, customs brokers, packaging staff, inspectors, office administrators. Entire families depend on those paychecks. IT doesn't stop there. When you add up the value of those imports and all the services wrapped around them, you get an economic machine worth $4.5 billion every single year. Not million, billion. And It all revolves around something as simple as a tomato crossing the border. Now, picture what happens when tariffs choke that flow. Fewer trucks crossing, warehouses suddenly half empty, distributors scrambling to cover rising costs, truck drivers waiting for work that isn't coming, local businesses that thrive on the constant movement, gas stations, repair shops, diners, all starting to feel the squeeze. The ripple effect is brutal. A tariff written on paper in D.C. translates into pink slips in Texas. For these communities, it's not an abstract debate about fair trade. It's food on the table. It's rent. It's survival. And while Texas workers braced for the fallout, Mexican farmers on the other side of the border were staring at an even bigger nightmare. Because for them, this wasn't just about a slowdown in shipments. It was about the collapse of their lifeline. By now, the internet was convinced this was a food war. Viral posts claimed that U.S. tomato shipments were being rejected at the border, that Mexico had banned American produce, and that billion-dollar deals were being signed behind closed doors. It sounded dramatic. It sounded explosive. But it wasn't the truth. When trade analysts and government reports finally cut through the noise, the reality was far less scandalous, but far more important. There were no mass rejections of U.S. tomatoes. No giant standoffs at the border. The confusion came from two overlapping events that social media twisted into one big myth. First, those 17% tariffs made Mexican tomatoes so expensive in the U.S. that many shipments simply weren't worth it anymore. Importers walked away, not because the tomatoes were rejected, but because the math didn't work. Second, Mexican exporters, like Veggie Prime, weren't sulking. They were adapting. They redirected shipments to Canada and Europe, where prices were better and politics were friendlier. To the outside world, it looked like Mexico was rejecting the U.S. and running into billion-dollar contracts abroad. In reality, by now, it was clear this wasn't just about a fruit in your salad bowl. The so-called tomato war of 2025 was really a warning shot, a glimpse of how fragile global trade has become. For decades, supply chains have been stitched together across borders. Beef, dairy, grains, fruit, all of it flows seamlessly between countries. That's why your grocery store looks the same in July as it does in December. But the tomato fight proved how easily politics can tear that system apart. One policy change in Washington, one tariff on a single crop, and suddenly millions of people felt the ripple effects. Farmers in Mexico saw their contracts collapse. Border economies in Texas braced for job losses. American families worried about food prices climbing out of control. And all of it happened almost overnight. And here's the bigger danger. This isn't unique to tomatoes. The same pressures are already building in other sectors. U.S. cattle ranchers are clashing with Brazilian beef exporters. Dairy producers are lobbying against European imports. Grain markets are tangled in disputes with Canada. Each fight looks local at first, but together they paint a picture of a world slipping into protectionism. For Mexico and the U.S., the tomato clash forced a painful truth into the open. Interdependence cuts both ways. America can't easily replace Mexican tomatoes, and Mexico can't easily replace the U.S. market. Both sides depend on each other, but politics doesn't care about that. That's why economists are calling the tomato war a test case. A real-time experiment showing how fragile our modern trade system is when governments start putting up walls. The consequences don't stay in one sector. They spill into regional GDP, inflation, jobs, and even diplomacy. And here's the unsettling thought. If a humble tomato can spark this level of disruption, what happens when the same tactics hit industries worth 10 or even 100 times more? Tech, steel, energy. The tomato war may look small today, but it could be the dress rehearsal for the economic battles of the future. So, what does all this mean for you, sitting at home, grabbing a salad, a sandwich, or a pizza? More than you think, because this isn't just a trade spat. It's a stress test for the global food system. One agreement ripped up in Washington, one tariff slapped on in the name of fair trade, and suddenly families pay more at the checkout line, farmers face bankruptcy, and entire border economies teeter on the edge. For consumers, it means one simple thing: be ready for volatility. Prices won't stay stable. Variety won't always be guaranteed. That little box of cherry tomatoes you buy without thinking twice, tomorrow it could cost twice as much or not be there at all. For farmers on both sides of the border, it's a brutal reminder of how vulnerable they are. Years of planning, investment, and hard work can be crushed by a single political decision. Survival now depends not just on growing crops, but on reading the winds of global trade and adapting faster than ever before. For economists and policymakers, the tomato war is a living case study. It proves that in today's interconnected world, protectionism doesn't just punish the other side. It ricochets back, disrupting jobs, prices, and stability everywhere. The lines between domestic and international markets have blurred so much that trying to wall one off is like trying to wall off the air. And here's the chilling part. If this much chaos can be unleashed by a tomato, what happens when the same strategies hit industries that are far bigger? Steel, energy, semiconductors, the very backbone of modern economies. The tomato war may be remembered not as a sideshow, but as the opening act of a new era of economic conflict. The next time you see a tomato in your kitchen, remember, it's more than food. It's a symbol of how fragile, how political, and how unpredictable our global supply chains have become. And if one tomato can start a war, what's coming next?